Welcome to those who are joining on the recording. Today we're restarting our docs and content calls with a view to try to explain a bit more about how we're thinking about documentation and content generally for qlang.org, but also slightly more broadly than that as well, as we'll cover in a bit. So the agenda for today is looking at where we are right now with alpha.qlang.org, and also something we briefly touched on the recent community call, which is Q by example. And then sort of talking at a bit of a sort of more meta level about where we want to be, where there is really the Q community more broadly, and our sort of hypothesis for where we think the community wants to be. Talk about community contributions with followed by a quick demo of what we have right now on alpha.qlang.org and Q by example, and then sort of open it up to sort of talk through any questions. We've got a few questions that have come in to chat through those in the remaining time. We will be recording we're already recording the call, and for those who are watching it, this is what you are watching. And we'll be linking it from the discussion that we created ahead of today's session. So moving on to where we are right now, we have Jonathan Matthews on the call. Jonathan has actually been helping with quite a bit of the content on alpha.qlang.org and Q by example. So this will end up being sort of quite a bit more of a discussion between mainly myself and Jonathan, but Dominic and Marcel are also on the call as well, as to where we are right now. So everyone feel free to jump in at any time, but especially Jonathan. So where are we right now? We currently at the old qlang.org, it still exists as qlang.org. But is sort of fairly familiar to anyone who's clicked through the site. It suffers a number of sort of fairly almost fatal problems. The lack of content examples, too theoretical in lots of places, very difficult to search. And there's not so much of a community-driven focus on the content on that site. So in addition to the other focus areas that we've talked about on our community calls, finding a replacement for qlang.org is something that we've been working on and spending time on. And as we hinted at on the last community call, we've actually sort of split that now into two different venues. Alpha.qlang.org, which is the soon-to-be official qlang.org, but is still hosted at alpha.qlang.org, something called Q by example. And so for the focus for today is really talking about these two new venues, we can just call them that, and why they exist as two separate venues, and what the goals behind each individually is, but also sort of that, as I said earlier on, that slightly overarching goal as well. Alpha.qlang.org is to be that soon-to-be official replacement for qlang.org. I will be promoted to being actually qlang.org. And so you can sort of really view that as being an area for the core Q documentation. This is going to therefore be fairly heavily reviewed, maintained, tested by the Q team. It's absolutely not, as we'll see a bit later on, absolutely not exclusive to only members of the Q team contributing to that content. Far from it. And Jonathan has been helping to contribute ideas, content, etc. to that. And so, as we'll also demonstrate in a later live stream, it should be relatively simple to contribute to the qlang.org. I'll refer to sort of alpha.qlang.org and qlang.org. I'll sort of blur the two now, sort of assuming that alpha.qlang.org has somewhat subsumed qlang.org. But the process of contributing should be relatively straightforward, but there's a sort of a bit more process, sort of curation around what content we actually want there. That will be involved in such a contribution. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But really, the focus should be on these foundational how-tos, tutorials, concept guides, and reference materials. Now, those four categories are very deliberate, as we'll see from the next slide. The overarching goal being for people to learn the principles of Q, the basics of Q, to really get them started and equip them with what they need to get going. As you can see from the right-hand side there, alpha.qlang.org, the site itself at the top there, the qlang.org repo is where the actual source code, the content, that drives the site exist, where that comes from. And a new docs and content repo, which we're in the process of populating right now, is where we will be tracking content ideas and the prioritization of the content creation. Now, we separated that out from the main Q issue tracker, really just so that we don't conflate what are two quite different things in the same issue tracker. So the docs and content repo is where we're going to be prioritizing content. And generally speaking, we'll sort of use that as a means of assigning content to people as well. Just using it as a communication tool, Jonathan, for example, so that you and I don't conflict on writing the same piece of content by accident. We can just create an issue and use that as a communication tool, for example, for saying, oh, you've got this piece.
And even if I weren't giving a hand with documentation stuff at the moment to somebody outside the process entirely, docs and content repo is where I might come and go, hey, I've got an idea for a piece of content or flag up an issue with something, right? That's open
exactly
to
so.
Use in that way.
Totally, and much like the main Q repo itself, a contribution to Q, and I think we put this quite nicely in the main contribution guide in the Q repo. A contribution to Q is more than just writing a piece of code for the Q project itself. It can be absolutely anything at all, from using Q at one end of the spectrum to writing a piece of code at the other, if you like. Issue gardening, creating issues, responding to issues, anything at all is a contribution here. And in much the same way, a contribution to alpha.qlang.org, which, as we said, will become qlang.org, could be just simply reading the content and going, hang on, there's a problem here, or I don't understand this. It could then be sort of the next step of saying, well, hang on, here's a proposal on how actually that gets fixed. Or the far end of the spectrum, it could be someone saying, actually, I want to take on writing a piece of content myself, and go and choosing a prioritized piece of content and saying, yep, here you go, here's that contribution. Okay, so that is alpha.qlang.org. As we said, there's those 4 categories there: the how-to-use tutorials, concept guides, and reference materials. As we've talked about on previous docs and content calls and previously, we're actually using an existing framework for how to think about documentation material. That's called the Diataxis. It's used by a number of other sites out there as a way of framing for people in a very practically oriented categorization, for want of a better phrase, of the different types of modes that users of the site will be in when they arrive. So here you can see those tutorials, how-to guides, explanation, which can also be referred to as like a concept guide, and reference material. And the 2 axes here are really whether someone is at study or at work on the horizontal axis, or whether they're, and on the vertical axis, whether they're looking for practical steps or sort of theoretical knowledge. And really, that's how we then want to decide, well, if we're thinking about a piece of content, the first question we ask ourselves, categorization-wise, is where does it sit on this Diataxis? And so that's really challenging us, or whoever is thinking about the piece of content, to think, well, who are we trying to serve here by creating this piece of content? And that's actually, Jonathan, I think you and I have struggled with this question on quite a few occasions when it comes to thinking about how we should classify a piece of content. And that upfront thinking has actually proved very useful.
It really has, hasn't it? Because that split down the sort of the left right, the serve the study and serve our work, has been such a useful wedge to put in the way of who's going to be reading this, what mode of learning are they in at the time that they come to read it, and thus what sort of content can we put in front of them? Because if it's a thing that they're learning, then we can't sort of put a very specific piece of, I don't know, third-party technology in front of them there, because we're trying to teach them, and that's like the Q side of things, not the other technology side of it. So has been really, really useful distinction.
It's very possible, indeed highly likely, that we haven't got this split quite right, or the categorization right. And so I think that's where it's going to be important for us to put this content in front of people and have them provide their feedback on the phrasing, the voice that is behind these bits of content. And that's something we'll just have to refine over time, I think. But broadly speaking, I think this is it's a good framework. Others have used it, and it's a good challenge up front to think about how to categorize things. And just as a refresher, this is the content that is for qlang.org. So it's very much this more curated, well-maintained, tested, foundational learning material. Hence, we want to be quite clear about how we're presenting it to people so that they've just got a familiarity with, as they click around the site, they should be comfortable with how they're holding a piece of content if they see a how-to, for example, versus a tutorial. Okay. So then moving on to talk about Q by example. This is a new idea. It's a bit of an experiment because there's a number of things which really don't belong on qlang.org, therefore. And we'll talk about the split in a second and why that split exists. The idea behind Q by example is that it should be a collection of Q use cases, solutions, and experiments. And almost by definition, therefore, that is something that is a bit more organic, experimental. The content itself is experimental, or the use of Q is a bit experimental. And it's therefore designed to be a bit much more free-form place in which people can share ideas or examples of how Q is being used. So the idea there is that it should be a much lower friction, lower barrier to actually publishing content. And instead of sort of relying on the Q team from like a maintenance perspective there, as we would on qlang.org, this is much more going to be a sort of an organic, self-maintained community-wide Q community maintained thing. So broadly speaking, unless some rather nifty automation is introduced, it's actually going to rely on people who are reading bits of content to spot problems or to flag issues that there might be that might need, for example, a special notes. Say, if you're doing X, then make sure you do Y. The idea, really, that the canvas is entirely blank here as to what we want to see. We have a number of bits of content that we have seeded there already, with a number of others that we will be adding ourselves and trying to encourage others to make contributions as well. But it's really a totally blank canvas as to what can be in this space here. The emphasis being on something that is community-driven, ideas, even people suggesting, oh, I would really like to see Q, an example of Q being used with XYZ system, for example. That's going to be in the Q by example repo. In contrast to qlang.org, there is only one Q by example repo. And so the issue tracking, discussion, the code, everything is all within the one repo. And that is shown there. We'll have links at the end of the presentation as well. So now just talking briefly, sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
I was just going to check in on that as somebody who's put a few bits of content into Q by example. I just want to check that I'm holding it right, that or I want to put out there, and I want to check that I'm putting the right thing into your head there, that things that I've written that maybe need a correction or maybe flagging up as this only works with a certain version of that other technology that we referenced there. That's the sort of thing we want people to come along and actually say, no, actually, no, you've missed something there. So just because I've originated that bit of content, anyone can come along and do a drive-by fix on any portion of that. That's certainly the way I'm holding it. And I'm not particularly precious about those things in the slightest.
I'd agree. I think there aren't sort of say any rules at the moment, other than if you look at the example bits of content that Jonathan has created there, and we'll see those a bit later on. There's a template that we sort of think is a good format to follow, and sort of using certain structures to present code or hide sort of larger blocks of code that works pretty well. Very open to ideas on people saying, actually, you know what, it would look better if you presented like this. Just briefly, the fact that we're using a GitHub repo with markdown files is really just reflects the experimental nature of it. Is that the final destination for that content? Probably not. It might well be we use those markdown files as part of a very simple static site, stick a search interface on top of it, and make it similar in feel to something like qlang.org, but on a different site. But for now, it's very easy and simple for us to bootstrap something from a GitHub repo. And because GitHub Markdown renders very, very nicely and has got certain UI features like copying blocks, etc., it's kind of easy for us to bootstrap that way. So without too much effort, we've spun up a few pieces of content there already and plan to add a number of others. But great point, Jonathan. Yes, it's in that respect, there are no rules on who can contribute, who can fix something. I think it's probably the case that, let's just imagine that somebody came along and found an issue with a piece of content that you'd created, that out of courtesy, we would CC you on a PR that looks to fix something. But I don't necessarily think, other than perhaps waiting maybe a day or two, we necessarily gate a fix on your approval for something, because you could, for example, a week later come along and say, oh no, that was a bad fix because of XYZ reason. We're just going to have to play a bit by ear as to how actually we sort of approve of changes or otherwise there. And again, it's sort of a bit more the nature of it. It's a bit more experimental, organic, see how it goes type thing.
Great. And what I really like about, I do like about the Qbyte example is that we've got the attribution sitting there on the on the documents. So yeah, I mean, if people add to a thing substantially or even small bit, and certainly I've written, slap people's names on it as well, and reflect the fact that it's gone through multiple sets of eyes, multiple sets of experiences of having been used, for sure.
Completely. And that's actually that point about attribution. We'll come back to that later on for both qlang.org and the Qbyte example stuff. Good point to mention. So just briefly looking at why the split between these different content venues. Really, there's different challenges that both seek to address. As we said, with qlang.org, alpha.qlang.org, really that's foundational Q learning, whichever path of the diataxis you're in. It's almost sort of by design that the content on qlang.org, therefore, is agnostic of a system, an application, whatever it might be, technology. Not least, and Jonathan, you made this point really well, in that if it's not, it's subject to needing to change or be maintained as quickly as that third-party system, application, technology, etc. might change. Whereas Q itself is not going to change as a language with anywhere near the cadence that some of these external systems might change. And so I think already that's a very natural split in terms of the rate of change. That we can sort of have the qlang.org material being, I don't want to say necessarily self-contained, but sort of, in that the learning there is almost entirely agnostic of where it can be applied by very nature of Q itself. And so reflecting that in the separation seems like a good thing to do, but I think you made the point really well in terms of the frequency of change.
And on the qlang side, qlang.org side, you can decide when that gets updated. You can make the very conscious stepping point between 0.6, 0.7, etc. Versus on the Qbyte example side, I think there's a piece of documentation in there with Terraform. I have to admit, I haven't tested that documentation with Terraform 1.6, for instance. So yeah, there's just all those externalities which I think you can avoid by having that split. That's I think a really useful characteristic there.
Another thing as well is that it just keeps helps to keep qlang.org nice and clean in terms of what content is there. For example, as we'll see a bit later on the Qbyte example, there's a piece of content about using Q with GitHub Actions. Now, GitHub Actions is just one of many CI systems. The challenge, I think, would be that if there's a piece on qlang.org about using Q with GitHub Actions, is that we sort of feel obligated in some way to have a piece of content on there for every CI system in order to appear balanced. And actually doing it this way round is quite nice, is we have that separation. You can still learn everything you need to about using Q in a CI situation on qlang.org, and then just quickly flip over. And I think it's probably going to be the case that we actually have a number of links, possibly both ways, between these two different venues to highlight, well, here are some practical applications if you're wanting to go from qlang.org to Qbyte example, and absolutely links in the other direction on Qbyte example of saying, if you're not familiar with disjunctions, for example, just check out this material over here on qlang.org. So I think that point's actually made pretty well at the bottom on the right hand side there. The overlap between these two venues is going to be intentional. It is that in some situations you don't want to be referring people to 6 different bits of content to learn about disjunctions, lists or whatever. Sometimes you may actually just want to pull all that learning into your Q by example thing, so someone can just read that one guide and be done and be like, oh, I got something done today, without having to go and read other bits of content. In other times, it will make sense to actually link between the two. So yeah, I think this gives us the best of both worlds, as it's sort of talking down the right-hand side, that we can have the foundational principles and also have the cake of the specific use cases, and just that separation really driven by the frequency of change, I think, as much as the vetting and the testing side of things, because vetting the self-contained examples on qlang.org is much simpler than trying to take on the burden of end-to-end testing what can be very complicated, what would be complicated to orchestrate integration tests in the Q by example stuff, just taking Terraform as one fairly frightening example. Good, okay. This really just talks about how the two sites then serve users and authors of content in sort of summary here. alpha.qlang.org, those foundational learnings about Q, system agnostic, automatically tested, comprehensively reviewed. Q by example, use cases solutions, wide variety of content, much more organic, early stage exploration, as well as proven content, but it's just a bit more freeform in structure. On the author side of things, then, that you sort of got complementary attributes really of those two different venues as well. So briefly talking about where do we want to be as well. And this is a bit more of a meta point here about what we're trying to achieve with documentation. Or let me be a bit more precise. What our hypothesis is about what we think is needed within the Q community and the Q ecosystem. So we here should really be read as the Q community. And here it's a hypothesis presented by us on the call today, but this is the idea, is to try and sort of see how this resonates. A Q content ecosystem that serves the community, grows the Q user base, serves a wide variety of use cases, empowers users and authors, and is both foundational and pragmatic. And really that aims to get at all aspects of the diataxis. And I think you can probably see the Q by example of the content venue as being mainly content that would otherwise fit into the how-to and tutorial segment of the diataxis, but as we said, it being sort of specific to a solution or an application or whatever it is. But that's where that's sort of the pragmatic aspect of it comes in. We're not trying to say that alpha.qlang.org or qlang.org is all of these things. We're trying to see these two venues in concert and working together. Briefly looking at community contributions. What Jonathan and I will do is actually record a couple of live streams demonstrating contributions to both venues, alpha.qlang.org and Q by example. I think for the Q by example one, Jonathan, we're going to try and create a complement to the GitHub Actions one by demonstrating how Q can be used with GitLab to sort of build out the library of CI examples there.
Yes, certainly no shortage of choices there, but I think GitLab's a really good choice for a next biggest ecosystem follow-up to the GitHub one.
On the CI side of things, for sure. We can also cover the issue gardening triage side of things. I think it's probably worth us spending a bit of time talking about the docs and content repo, because that will be more fully fleshed out in terms of the issues that are there, and we can talk through those a bit more in that call. Otherwise, if you have questions, ideas, content, please, if you want to get in touch by good old email, documentation@qworks. Otherwise, in Slack, qlang.org is the channel that we have there. We should actually, and when we publish the slides, I'll include a link here to the docs and content repo as well, just so that, because that's a good place to either start a discussion or raise an issue in case you've got any ideas. Now for a bit of a demo. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Let me just reorganize my screens 1 second. Sorry, this is just requiring a bit of gymnastics screens-wise. Okay. So here we have You should be able to see the alpha.qlang.org site. We're getting close on alpha.qlang.org. The front page will be the last of those bits of the site to actually land. But what we're going to do now is actually give you a bit of a glance through, a bit of a run through the site itself. So the documentation tab is where we're actually going to have people land. This is probably going to undergo a bit of a change itself in terms of the layout here. One of the things we found is that trying to organize and structure documentation with Q is very tricky if we want to apply any sort of hierarchical structure to it. So instead, what we're going to lean on quite heavily is search. And search is, there's the search icon up in the top right-hand corner here, which you can just type away. But here you can see what we've done is we've limited content types to how-to guides. And there's any number of bits of content here that you can then finesse this. For example, if we also wanted to reduce this down to include the word mark, as in marker field is required or marker field is optional. So search is going to be a pretty useful way for people actually navigating and finding bits of content on the site itself. We aren't going to ignore indexes like this. And in just a second, what I'll do is we just go to the left-hand side here, talking now about the left-hand side navigation. These again are sort of these are the pages which will actually be finessed as kind of like a last step. You notice we've sort of got the categories down the left-hand side here actually follow the diet axis. So tutorials, how-to guides, concept guides, and reference material. And this is very, very deliberate because this is the only structure that actually we think makes sense when it comes to organizing content on qlang.org. Because anything else, you sort of get stuck in a bit of a directory structure quandary where you want it to belong to multiple directories at the same time. And instead, let's just jump to a how-to guide as an example here. You can see this how-to guide marker field is required. We said at the beginning that the category where it sits in the diet axis is something that will not change. So if we're writing a how-to guide, that is someone at work wanting sort of practically oriented advice on how to get something done, right? They're not at study. It's not theoretical. It's very practically oriented. So fundamentally, that piece of content is never going to change away from being a how-to. So that top level, as we've got it in the path here, it is not going to change. So that's a nice thing. But within that, there's sort of different categories that we might want to assign to bits of content. And that's where we're going to leverage pretty heavily tagging. So here we've got language and commented Q. And commented Q is just a specific tag that we've got for how-tos where we lean pretty heavily on actually providing this example with quite a lot of comment going through it as well to show people, here is some Q, here is in this situation, it's some Q and YAML. It's combining those two, it's actually running QVet in this situation to demonstrate how to require a field in a Q schema and then validate that it's actually there, in this case, validating some YAML. So in this situation, this should be a very practical example that someone can find. It's a how-to. The idea being that someone should be able to quickly search, and if they search for field require YAML, for example, this should be a how-to that props up pretty close to the top. And if they wanted to limit it to how-to guides as well, they'd be further refining the search. So we're hoping that search actually is a pretty heavily used way in which people navigate to bits of content. And then once they find, for example, in this case here, oh, commented Q is a nice style of content, you can then click on a label like this and then be taken to all types of content that are commented Q in that situation. And so your learning journey can sort of follow from that place onwards, if you liked the commented Q as an example. Jonathan?
The reason I really do like those commented Q ones is because if you go back one page, you can use the copy blocks. We've got the copy links in each of the left and right.
Yeah.
You can just pick it up and it only picks up the Q content, and then you can modulo changing the field names for the specific purpose that you have your actual data structure. You can just use it. That's what I really, really like about those, the way that they come across.
Yeah, and we'll just see this in a second. But as you said, not only the code blocks have copy here, but also the command blocks as well. And in this situation, it only actually ends up copying the highlighted commands, none of the cruft that's around it there. So that's an example of a how-to. We have an example of a tutorial here, and tutorials, generally speaking, and this is something else we're experimenting with, but it's nice to have steps in these situations. So you can see these are linkable, so that if you're talking about step 2 and you want to share that with someone for whatever reason, either you found a bug with step 2, for example, or you want to highlight step 2 to someone, you can then just click it and link to it. A tutorial is slightly different in that it's not just like a simple pithy explanation of how to get something done. It probably requires more steps. And in some situations, we don't actually want to make too many assumptions about prerequisites, although in this situation, having a tool to edit some text files is a pretty reasonable prerequisite to my mind, and a command terminal as well. Otherwise, what we might actually find in tutorials is some steps being, or concepts being repeated that are sort of mentioned elsewhere. And that's very, very deliberate, because we're not trying to have just a single document where installing Q is explained, for example, or a single document, a single part of a page where the concept of disjunctions is explained. It's actually sometimes very good that it is explained in a slightly different way in different settings. It just helps people absorb content in different ways, is our experience.
And I really like the approach that we've taken with those tutorials, saying a person who comes in who meets those prerequisites should be able to follow it top to tail without having to have been diverted into another page to learn X, Y, or Z. That is a complete thing that they can go through. I think that works really well for perhaps people on the getting used to Q, learning about the early bits of Q that they go on that learning journey. I think that's a really, really useful characteristic of those tutorials.
Generally speaking, we don't tend to link to other bits of content in a tutorial because that distracts you from the flow. Downloading, installing Q is probably, Jonathan, the one exception to that, because it's sort of common to everything as a reasonable starting point, especially for tutorials. Yeah. But otherwise, you should just be able to click through and copy and paste these blocks and reproduce the tutorial totally. And the reason we can say that with some confidence is all of the content on alpha.qlang.org is fully tested. This was actually something of a problem with the old qlang.org, is that it wasn't. The challenge is that if it's not automatically tested, things bit rot very, very quickly, and it's extremely expensive from a human perspective and very boring to go through and check them. So actually putting in place some automation here was a key part of that, and it just gives us such a high degree of confidence in the content itself, and it makes it a whole load easier to create content as well. We'll demonstrate that in a live stream. Jonathan, I think with the alpha.qlang.org live stream, we should just come up with a relatively straightforward how-to or tutorial that we sort of at least create in skeleton form, writing it from scratch, so we can show how the preprocessor in that situation helps provide that confidence when authoring a piece of content, and then pushing it for review, and then publishing it. We might just sort of perhaps not finesse the piece of content itself, but just publish it for the sake of showing how that actually works. As you can see, the sort of the structure here is we focus within a tutorial on it being step-based and being very clear what you should be doing at that step, with any sort of description and explanation following. And that's a very deliberate presentational thing as well. We want to, if anyone's interested in the detail or just refreshing themselves on some concepts in this situation here, we're talking about required fields, disjunctions, optional fields. That follows in the bit afterwards. Otherwise, it should be possible to sort of semi-skim a tutorial in this situation by just looking at the code blocks and perhaps the one-liner that appears before them. So that's a tutorial. Again, you can sort of just referencing on the left-hand side here, we've got very basic table of contents of the page itself. Skipping on to the language guide. The language guide is actually one of the key parts that is being worked on right now, that is designed to be a replacement for most people for the Q spec. Now, the Q language specification still exists as a reference piece of material, but the language guide itself is like being elevated now to a higher degree of prominence, as it were, in that the Q spec is really just a specification for the Q language itself. It's not intended to be a source of learning per se. The language guide is designed to be a much gentler introduction to Q, the language itself. Now, the important thing to note is the language guide, even though it's sort of shown as a special category on the left-hand side here, the language guide is still a reference guide in this respect. It's definitely not a how-to, and it's definitely not a tutorial, because it's much broader in its scope. And so it is for someone who is at study. And this isn't a judgment on the language guide itself, but it is more theoretical in that there's not a specific thing that is trying to be achieved. So a tutorial and a how-to, by contrast, are trying to get something practical done. And so the language guide is just almost, you could view it like a book about the Q language itself. And that would be a pretty good way to hold the language guide in terms of someone wanting to learn Q, they could read the language guide once complete from beginning to end and feel that they're comfortable with all of the Q language itself and large amounts of the tooling as well and APIs. So that's the language guide. The Q language specification just exists as a reference material, as a reference point. And again, all of these pages, all of the content on alpha.qlang.org is backed by the Algolia search up in the top right-hand corner. Concept guides are this slightly, I always found it quite hard, Jonathan, to work out what to put in the concept guide space until you find a piece of content that so obviously belongs there. And the logic of Q is one such example. That I
love the diataxis.fr's way of explaining it. They have a very pithy bit for concept guides, which is, if you're that way inclined, concept guides or explanations, as they sometimes call it, are the things that you might print out and read in the bath. I really love that as a that's it. It's a long form read or exploring something that isn't necessarily in a I want to learn a specific thing or learn about a specific thing. It's just that surrounding material that might help you to more deeply understand something, and is probably, if you're again that way inclined, really quite an enjoyable read in terms of what you're looking at.
Yeah, I think the concepts get pretty philosophical. That's always kind of nice.
Nice to see you, Cedric. Completely. I think the logic of Q is a good example, and there are. We haven't finished, and this is my hands up here. We haven't finished populating the docs and content repo issues yet, but there are a number of bits of content that fit into this concept guide area that are really reflections, more thought-provoking pieces. Right? They're not reference material in that respect. And so, yeah, look forward. There's quite a strong overlap, incidentally, I think, between material that is probably a concept guide and that which would appear as a blog as well. They're very different venues altogether, but those thought pieces are often things as well that you might tend to share as a blog. And we'll talk about the blog briefly in a second. The playgrounds, this is something that at the moment exists in very bare bones form as a slightly redesigned version or heavily redesigned version of what already exists as a playground. I have to first of all admit that the playground was one of my earliest contributions to the Q project, and also one of my worst in terms of the content, the quality of the code. So the existing playground is horrendous. Much to my delight, it is one of the most used parts of the qlang.org space, because it's so easy to share examples. It's so easy to quickly hack something and test it out, but it's very, very poor in terms of its thinking, etc. So what we started to do here is think about how we can improve things with the playground. So just wanted to briefly talk about that now. This is definitely not finished, but it's a starting point. So for starters, we wanted to keep the playground as a full screen app, if we can call it that. But what we wanted to do was introduce this concept of different modes. So here we need a better name than function, so please help us out with that. We have what is called function mode, and maybe let's just make this a couple of dials bigger here for the screen share. Function mode is designed to be an equivalent to what we already have, and I've managed to lose my cursor here. Let me just reload the site. There we go. So here we can specify what the input is and what the output should be. In this case, let's just say we want the output to be JSON. So this is almost like a direct replacement for the playground as it exists. However, what we want to do, and let me just click through the policy now, is have this ability to specify multiple files as input, perhaps with specific use cases in mind. So policy mode here is actually very much inspired by the OPA playground, where in the OPA playground, you specify a policy, in that case in Rego, then you specify some input, in that case in JSON in the OPA playground, some data, again, JSON in the Rego example, the OPA example, and then some output, which is the result of having run that policy across the input and the data. There are many ways in which Q could do something similar. And so this is the idea behind having these different workspaces. Again, we need a slightly different name there probably. JSON validation, as you can see, is one such other hypothesized mode in which we could have a different playground workspace, i.e. you write some Q, which is your schema, you have another file or tab for your JSON input, and then you have the validation results in your quotes output pane in that situation. So the idea here is that we should be able to spin up relatively easily new workspaces, as we're currently naming them within the playground, and then just have it sort of almost declarative that we can declare these things and then people can click around them and share things in exactly the way they have done before. So we have the same concept of sharing things. We haven't populated any yet, but this examples dropdown is very much intended to be a very quick and easy way of sharing examples between folks. So again, these examples would be pre-populated in alpha.qlang.org itself. And Jonathan, I guess this is pretty much like the commented Q examples here, is that they're self-contained examples, which you click it opens schema.q, data.yaml. Imagine we had sort of the multi-pane version here, and the result is here as well. It's all pre-canned effectively for you to then just go in and tweak it.
I was about to say, wouldn't it be nice if perhaps we almost harmonise or made the things that are available as commented Q as a subset of the example, so that you can play with any one of them.
Yeah, very much inspired by the Go project, where they have playgrounds that you can click through to from documentation. We'll do exactly the same here. So you can click through from this example to the playground in this situation, and it would load it. Okay, very briefly, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and we've been talking, Jonathan, for quite a bit longer than, but this is a good demo. The blog is not started yet, but this is the blog section. Here we have a nice picture of a cow for now.
No notes. That's perfect. Leave it as is. Freeze it.
The blog will be something we start to flesh out and start to publish articles through there. Now, briefly to cut over to Q by example, as we said, this is the alternative content venue for those more solutions, system, application specific things, much more freeform in nature in terms of what can be contributed here. It's very much intentionally experimental now, and as we said, it's deliberate that this is currently hosted and served in GitHub as a content venue, just because we want to be a bit more experimental. The idea for now is that we just have a very plain and simple index on the repo's README page, and that links through to bits of content. So let's just take a look at the first of those, which is driving GitHub Actions workflows with Q. Here, Jonathan wrote this piece of content. As you can see, we've got attribution at the top here, which is an important thing. And let me just make this a couple of dials bigger. We think it's important for content. Actually, we didn't point that out, Jonathan. Let's go back here. Marking a field as required. Attribution here, we also have the ability to click to Jonathan's profile and search for all content by Jonathan. Attribution is an important thing to our mind, in that on the main qlang.org site itself and Q by example, if people are going to the effort of actually creating this content, if they've been majority contributed to a piece of content, or even if they've sort of contributed in a fairly significant way, they should be being recognized. And so capturing that also just allows, if I start to enjoy content that Jonathan has created, then I should just be able to quickly click through and link to is QBar example a separate website? Yes, it is. It's an entirely separate repo, and deliberately so for now. Cedric, it is more experimental in nature. Just before you joined, we talked about how for now it's just organically starting in a repo, a GitHub repo, simply that we can just get stuff off the ground nice and quickly. Then what we'll likely do is, well, it's a very easy step to follow, is stand up a very simple static site that almost serves the identical markdown files with an Algolia search over the top of it and just a nice UI. But for now, we're just bootstrapping this separate from qlang.org. And we just, again, just before you joined, we talked about the reasons for the split there, really being that the rate of change of things like Terraform or GitHub Actions, etc., it is, if you look at the rate of change across all the different situations in which Q could be used, it far outpaces the rate of change that we want to be making content changes on qlang.org. So it's a nice reason for actually separating the content out to have these solutions, technology specific content on a different site. So here, just Jonathan has, we've sort of hypothesized a straw man of what a good structure is here for these currently GitHub Markdown renderings. So we've got these nice little icons indicating where you've got things you actually need to do. Contrast those with, here we go, a nice little floppy disk icon here where actually we want to save a file. And giving the file path in that situation. So here is a complete example of how you can actually convert your repo, and this is based on a live stream that I did some time ago of how you can convert your GitHub Actions from YAML to Q and then drive them using Q, which is what we do in the Q project itself.
We've gone to quite a bit of effort to make sure that the copy icon on each pre-block is a useful thing that you can do. It does require writing things, and we ask people to use a template that's set up with that sort of formatting in place. It does require writing things perhaps in a subtly different way from one, command output is what one might naturally do. It does mean that we have to bake all of the command stuff into its own block so that it can be copied and pasted. But I think
here's an example.
Nice effect, a nice characteristic for the reader.
Here's an example of exactly what Jonathan was talking about. Here is the commands, and then we say, here's what the output actually looks like, rather than, let's just jump over to here, for example, on the qlang.org site. We combine the two, but we can be so clever, as it were, because this copy button knows that it should only be copying the actual commands themselves and not the output or indeed the prompts. So the qlang.org site is itself more clever. Here we've just got the plain and simple copy facility that exists within a code block on the GitHub site. So we need to be a bit more straightforward.
It's more like a styling guide on how to structure our content.
Okay. Exactly, yeah. And so we've gone for something that's as simple as possible, really, to get things off the ground on the QBar example. And as we said, we'll do a live stream that demonstrates the contribution of the GitLab, how to use GitLab workflows with Q as well, as sort of a contrast to the GitHub one.
Got it.
The docs and content repo, again, mea culpa, I haven't managed to, ahead of this call, actually populate this. The issues section here should have, and we have these in a separate private context for now, a whole load of issues capturing all the different ideas we have for bits of content in all the areas of the diataxis. So if you're watching this on the recording and go to qlang docs and content, you will see it nicely populated with all the issues, with all the ideas. But for now, you sort of have to imagine that, given you're watching the video. QBar example, as we said, by contrast, the QBar example repo, just as a refresher, is the place where the content is, and it's also the place where we've got the issue tracking as well. So there's not that separation of issue tracking and content venue when it comes to QBar example. So, for example, here again, there's a number of ideas to transfer over from the from our master list of content. But Jonathan, you and I did a Q and Terraform experiment earlier on in the year. It would be a huge write-up to actually do that as a README. But there's just an idea we could add to this list, as we will, using Q to drive GitLab, build Kite, Pulumi. There's a number of bits of content which people have already done live streams for. And so there's a pretty nice pre-populated list of content where I say it's just a case of creating a markdown file. I think in the case of the Terraform example, that just is doing quite a lot of work there, because as we demonstrated on the live stream itself, there's a fair amount of setup required on the Terraform side of things for it to be a real thing, even though the Q aspect of that is relatively small.
Paul, you've used the word experiment in a few different places, and we've actually got it flagged at the top level of Q by example.
Yep.
You just said, how should people hold that sort of experimental thing? Should they view the content that's in there as experimental when they come to actually look at it? What's the context for that?
It's a good question. I think our hypothesis at the moment is purely that this content didn't belong on qlang.org. As we said, that the cadence of change of the content, the specificity of it didn't fit well with qlang.org sort of being that space where you want that foundational learning about Q. So that's why it's sort of in a separate venue. Almost by definition, therefore, we don't have a good blueprint for what it should be, the form, the structure, etc. So that's the experimental nature of it. Some of these bits of content, for example, controlling Kubernetes with Q, this is actually a slightly tweaked version of the original Q Kubernetes tutorial. So the content itself is actually quite mature. It's well tested. It's a key part of Q itself to be able to drive Kubernetes with Q. And so that piece of content, whilst it's sitting on a site that is termed experimental, it is absolutely should work and will work. Because it's a foundational part of Q. So I think there's a mix. Really, the presentation, i.e. the structure on the site here, is experimental. As we said, we might well stand this up in a static site. When it comes to the bits of content themselves, I think there's almost deliberately a mixed bag. So if we were to contrast the Kubernetes tutorial, as it's now rebranded here, with Jonathan, a piece that you've written here on managing Mythic Beasts DNS with Q, and we're going to follow this up with a managing pork bun DNS with Q as well. It's more people showcasing what they've tried and done and how they're using Q in different ways. And so it's going to be a mixed bag. So when I think we probably need at the top of each piece of content some indication as to how solid that piece of content is. The Kubernetes tutorial would be very solid. Managing Mythic Beast DNS zones with Q, quite solid.
I wonder if we should put a discussion in place that people can, thumbs up, thumbs down of how, have you tried this out? Did it work for you in outside the context of merely the author's laptop?
Actually, that's an idea that if we stood this up in a static site, we could relatively easily add a comment section below a piece of content where people could just say something like, this content's not working for me, rather than requiring them to raise an issue. It's just there. They can easily type a comment in using something like discuss or whatever.
But fundamentally, the experimental tag isn't attached to a specific bit of content.
No.
Certainly at the moment, the content has got to be evaluated on its own merits.
I think we should probably just move that word experimental to just make clear that whilst the repo and the structure is experimental, we're just trying to find our way with how best to present and curate these sorts of examples.
How much do you think these examples will change as we change the language and improve the tooling? Because I could see a lot of it, modules, code rewriting, code gen. That could significantly change how we approach problems.
That's a great question. So let me just deal with that in two parts. First, the Qlang, any content on qlang.org will by definition be rewritten in terms of those new concepts, and that's sort of on on the Q team, if you like, to fix and make sure they are idiomatic, that everything works, etc. And we won't be able to release a version of Q without actually having achieved that. Q by example, it's then really on the Q community, and we include ourselves in that to update those examples. To be, let's take modules as a great example, because whereas before it required a bit of copy paste and a bit of hacking somewhere, as soon as you move over to modules, you can fundamentally change the way you write something. For example, the GitHub Actions one, it's just so much nicer. You get reuse at a level where before you copied and pasted between repos. So I think it really then comes down to deciding, do you want to leave the original piece of content in place and write a new piece of content with a sort of adding a redirect perhaps, or a message at the top of the old piece of content saying, if you're looking at this piece of content, you might actually want to be looking at this version that uses modules, just to leave the old version in place? Maybe, I don't know. Again, sort of need to work out what the best way to structure those sorts of things is, but it'll really be to try to, for us to sort of encourage, to lead from the front ourselves, but also encourage others to say, you know what, I'm going to rewrite this tutorial or this Q by example, excuse me, to use modules. And for someone to spin up a version of it, push up a PR, someone do a quick review of it and submit it, and then we're off at that point. And so that's the whole point about the Q by example stuff being a bit more organic. In some situations, Jonathan made the point earlier on, it's just really hard to write fully fledged integration tests of this stuff. Take anything involving Terraform, particularly if you involve Terraform Cloud. It's just almost impossible to write a fully fledged integration test of a piece of content in that scenario. So it is going to be that just reliant on people reading it, flagging issues, working out, oh, this is the bug, fixing it, submitting a PR, changing it, that very quick loop of things. And I think the same will be true when it comes to then changes in the language or the tooling, of which there should hopefully be a very much smaller number on the language side of things. But on the tooling side, as we start to develop that, or the Go API side, I think it'll just be beholden on us and the Q community more broadly to just say, okay, time to tackle this Q by example and rewrite it in terms of the new API or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with your points. I will say that when we're talking about things like adding new language features or new ways of doing things, that's like not as simple as like, you know, you can't lint that, right? It's more like conceptual. We're approaching this problem a completely different way.
Yeah,
I will say
point.
for the integration testing part, I hear you for sure. And I think something I've been thinking about a while, it probably makes more sense if we want to tackle that holistically. Like we probably have to wrap Q in a tool, and then we can like test that tool in like a, you know, standard software engineering way if we actually want to do that comprehensively, because otherwise, you know, composing like say the CLI and stuff, I think can only take you so far. But that's like
totally
more philosophical. You know, we've been talking about that a while. Like, how do you integrate Q into arbitrary whatever? So,
yep. Honestly, Cedric, I think we definitely don't claim to have with the hypothesis / straw man that we present here, we don't have all the answers for QLang.org. We certainly don't have all the answers for Q by example, and so it's a case of learning as we go, getting feedback, ideas from people, and just being quick to integrate those, try them out, experiment with them, etc. So that's the plan with all of this.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, like, you know, can't really get involved in the language yet. Not my expertise. I'm trying to get the saddle thing working, but it seems like I probably have to wait for some core stuff to be provided from like the Q API perspective. But like stuff like this, I could probably get it started immediately. So that'd be cool.
Cool. Great. And so sort of then really on to next steps, because as far as we're running slightly over, so what are the next steps? We've talked about live streaming, how to add content to Q by example and alpha.qlang.org. Jonathan, that's on you and me to do that. And we'll get that done in as short order as possible. We're just finalizing things on the alpha.qlang.org side of things. There's polish required in a number of different places, but then we flip that over to being qlang.org. And then we can have people relying more on the search to drive their content needs. Future docs and content calls. I think we originally used to have them every fortnight. We'll just have to see what sort of cadence makes sense. I don't think that would be a bad suggestion, but let's just see how we go on that. We'll be sure to advertise when they are coming up. For example, the next one might be slightly more than 2 weeks, because if we tried to do a couple of live streams in between as well, we're giving ourselves a fairly decent chunk of work to actually get done before the next Docs and Content call. And then writing lots of content. The idea will be is with those 2 live streams, we can sort of pin up as 2 poster examples, if you like, how straightforward it should be. And again, if there are any rough edges we hit along the way, Jonathan and anybody else who's creating content, we should just be fixing those to making it as easy as possible to contribute content. Just pinning those up as poster examples, if you like, of how to contribute to those 2 different venues. And then I'll use the word just again, even though it does quite a lot of work, just turning the handle on it and writing lots of content. One thing we've totally missed from this list here is me actually doing what I should have done before this call, which is populating the Docs and Content repo with the ideas for bits of content. I will absolutely do that and make sure that then when we come to the live stream, Jonathan, on how to add content to alpha.qlang.org, we start by looking at that repo and sort of imagining that we've actually plucked an idea from there and actually then writing it, even though we'll have sort of done a bit of prep behind the scenes already.
Yeah, doing that full end-to-end journey, showing what anyone
exactly
could do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. We're slightly over. Cedric, thanks for joining and for asking a couple of questions along the way. For anybody who's watching the recording afterwards, let's just go back to here. The qlang.org Slack channel is a good place. Otherwise, we should also, I will tweak the slides as well to also include the GitHub link as well to GitHub discussions in the main Q repo in case folks have any questions there. Just please get in touch and we can tackle them wherever in Slack or on GitHub. Otherwise, thanks for joining and look forward to seeing some content along the way.